The wind howled across the empty prairie like a lonely cry that never reached heaven. Dust rolled across the dry road, chasing the last light of the setting sun as a young woman stumbled through the fading glow. Her boots were worn thin, her dress torn by miles of desperate travel, and the fear in her eyes made the cold evening feel even colder. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though no one in the small western towns she passed through seemed to care. To them she was just another hungry traveler, another broken soul wandering through a land that had little mercy to spare. For 3 days she had walked without food. Her last coin had been traded for a piece of stale bread at a roadside store, and even that had barely kept her on her feet. Every mile felt heavier than the last. Every step carried the quiet terror that she might collapse and never stand again. But turning back wasn't an option. Behind her was a life she refused to return to, a place filled with cruelty, shouting, and the kind of pain that left marks no one could see. Ahead of her, she didn't know. As darkness crept over the plains, Clara spotted something in the distance. A ranch house. It stood alone against the horizon, surrounded by wide pastures and wooden fences that stretched farther than her tired eyes could follow. A faint light flickered in one of the windows. Hope. It was fragile, trembling like a candle in the wind, but it was enough to keep her moving. Step by step she walked toward the ranch, her legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion. By the time she reached the wooden gate, her vision blurred and her hands shook. Inside the pasture, a tall man stood beside a horse, tightening the saddle strap as twilight deepened around him. He noticed her immediately. The rancher straightened slowly, watching the stranger approach with cautious eyes. Out here in the wild lands, unexpected visitors often meant trouble. Clara stopped several feet away from him, barely able to remain standing. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "Please, take me. I'll do anything." The words hung in the evening air like a fragile confession. The rancher's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. He was a large man, broad-shouldered from years of hard labor beneath the sun. A worn hat shadowed his face, but the quiet steadiness in his gaze revealed something rare in this harsh land: kindness. His name was Daniel Hayes. For a moment, he simply studied the desperate young woman before him. He saw the dust covering her dress, the trembling in her hands, the exhaustion carved deep into her face. She looked like someone who had fought a long battle just to survive. Daniel stepped closer, careful not to startle her. "You look like you've been through a storm," he said quietly. Clara's strength finally gave out. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen to the ground if Daniel hadn't caught her just in time. For a moment she leaned against him, too weak to even apologize. Daniel lifted her gently as if she weighed nothing and carried her toward the ranch house. The wooden door creaked open as warm light spilled across the porch. Inside, the house smelled of fresh bread and burning firewood. Daniel laid Clara carefully on the small couch near the fireplace and placed a blanket over her shoulders. She watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. No anger, no harsh words, just quiet concern. Daniel poured a glass of water and handed it to her. "Drink slowly," he said. Her hands trembled as she held the glass. The cool water felt like life returning to her body. Tears suddenly filled her eyes. Not because she was sad, but because someone had finally shown her kindness. Daniel pulled a chair near the couch and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "Now," he said gently, "tell me why a woman like you is wandering alone across the prairie." Clara looked down at her hands. For a long time she didn't speak. Then the truth came out in broken pieces. She told him about the small town she ran from, about the man she had been forced to marry, about the cruelty she endured every single day until the night she finally escaped. Daniel listened without interrupting, his jaw tightened slightly with each painful detail. When she finished, the room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Clara wiped her tears quickly. "I know I shouldn't ask," she whispered. "But I can work, I can cook, clean, take care of animals, anything you need." She hesitated before adding softly, "I just need somewhere safe." Daniel stood and walked to the window, staring out across the dark fields. For years this ranch had been quiet. Too quiet. Ever since his wife passed away 5 winters ago, the house had felt empty no matter how much work he filled his days with. He had grown used to the silence. But now, something had changed. He turned back toward Clara. She looked so fragile sitting there, wrapped in the blanket like someone afraid the world might shatter again at any moment. Daniel stepped closer and knelt beside her. His voice dropped to a gentle whisper. "You don't have to beg here." Clara looked up at him, confused. Daniel gave a small, reassuring smile. "You're the woman I've been waiting for." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't mean it the way you think," he quickly added with a quiet chuckle. "This ranch has needed someone with courage, someone strong enough to survive this land." He stood and extended his hand. "How about you stay a while and see if this place can become home?" For the first time in weeks, Clara felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. A small smile slowly appeared on her tired face as she placed her hand in his. But neither of them knew that the past she tried to escape was already beginning to follow her across the prairie. And the peaceful ranch would soon face a storm far greater than either of them expected. Morning arrived slowly over the prairie, spilling soft gold across the endless fields surrounding Daniel Hayes' ranch. The quiet land stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by fences, grazing cattle, and the lonely silhouette of the ranch house standing against the horizon. For years the mornings here had felt the same, silent, predictable, empty in a way Daniel had learned to live with. But this morning was different. Inside the house, Clara Whitmore woke to the warm crackle of a fire still burning in the stone fireplace. For a moment she didn't move. She simply stared at the wooden ceiling above her, trying to understand where she was. Then memory rushed back. The long road, the hunger, the rancher who had caught her before she collapsed. She slowly sat up on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket Daniel had placed around her the night before. The warmth of the room felt almost unreal compared to the cold nights she had spent sleeping under open skies. From the kitchen came the soft sound of dishes. Clara stood carefully and walked toward the doorway. Daniel stood by the stove, flipping thick slices of bread in a cast-iron pan while coffee boiled gently nearby. He looked over his shoulder when he heard her footsteps. "Well," he said with a small smile, "looks like you survived the night." Clara nodded shyly. "I don't remember falling asleep." "You were halfway gone when you got here," Daniel replied. "Figured food and sleep would do more good than questions." The smell of breakfast filled the room, and Clara realized how truly hungry she was. Daniel placed a plate in front of her at the table, eggs, bread, and a small bowl of beans. "Eat," he said simply. Clara hesitated. No one had prepared food for her in years. Slowly she began eating, at first carefully, then with the desperate hunger of someone who had gone too long without a proper meal. Daniel pretended not to notice. He simply poured coffee and looked out the window toward the pastures. After a while Clara spoke. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it." Clara didn't ask more. The quiet sadness in his voice told her enough. Outside, the ranch slowly came to life. Horses moved along the fence line, cattle wandered through the grass, and the wind carried the distant creak of barn doors. After breakfast Daniel showed Clara the ranch. It was larger than she expected. Wide fields, a red barn, several horses, and cattle grazing across the land like dark moving shadows. "This place runs on hard work," Daniel explained. "If you're staying, you'll have plenty of it." Clara nodded eagerly. "I'm not afraid of work." Daniel studied her carefully. Despite the exhaustion in her face, there was determination in her eyes. "Good," he said, "because ranch life doesn't show mercy." The first days were difficult. Clara learned to feed the chickens, clean the barn, haul water, and mend fences. The work left her muscles aching, but for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. Daniel watched her quietly. He noticed how she never complained. How she thanked him for even the smallest kindness. How the sadness in her eyes slowly began to fade with each passing day. Evenings became their quiet routine. They would sit on the porch watching the sunset burn across the plains while the cattle settled in the distance. Sometimes they spoke about the ranch. Sometimes about the weather. Sometimes they simply sat in silence. And somehow that silence no longer felt lonely. But peace on the prairie rarely lasts forever. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Clara arrived, a cloud of dust appeared on the distant road leading to the ranch. Daniel noticed it first. He stood still beside the barn, watching carefully as a horse rider approached. Something about the man's posture made Daniel uneasy. When the rider finally reached the ranch gate, Clara stepped out of the house carrying a bucket of water. The moment she saw him, the bucket slipped from her hands and crashed onto the dirt. Her face went pale. Daniel turned immediately. "Clara," her voice trembled. "He found me." The rider dismounted slowly, tall, thin, his expression twisted with cold anger. It was Harold Whitmore, Clara's husband, the man she had fled from. Harold walked toward the house like he owned the land. "Well now," he sneered, glancing around the ranch. "Looks like my runaway wife found herself a new home." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between Harold and Clara. "Stop right there," Harold laughed. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Owner of this ranch," Daniel replied calmly. Harold's eyes narrowed. "That woman belongs to me." Clara trembled behind Daniel. Daniel's voice remained steady. "No one belongs to anyone here." Harold stepped closer, anger rising in his face. "You don't understand, rancher. That woman is my property." The word hit Clara like a knife. Daniel's jaw tightened. He took one step forward, his voice suddenly cold as steel. "Say that again." Harold hesitated. Something about Daniel's calm strength made the air feel dangerous. Clara stepped out from behind Daniel, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm not going back." Harold turned toward her, his expression dark. "You think you have a choice." Daniel's hand rested quietly near his belt. "You heard her," he said. Harold looked from Clara to Daniel. For a long moment the wind blew across the prairie, carrying the tension between the three of them. Finally Harold spat into the dirt. "This isn't over." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust behind him. But the threat hung in the air long after he disappeared. Clara's knees nearly gave out. Daniel caught her gently. "He'll come back," she whispered. Daniel looked across the wide land of his ranch. His home. The place he had built with years of sweat and sacrifice. Then he looked at Clara. The woman who had arrived broken and desperate but had brought life back into the empty house. His voice was quiet but firm. "Let him." Days passed, but the tension remained. Clara feared every sound of approaching hooves. But Daniel never showed worry. Instead, he worked harder than ever, repairing fences, preparing the ranch, keeping watch over the land. Then one night, just as the moon rose over the plains, the sound finally came. Horses. More than one. Daniel stepped onto the porch and saw them, 3 riders approaching through the darkness. Harold had returned, and this time he had brought men with him. Clara stood behind Daniel, fear in her eyes. "You should leave," she whispered. "I don't want you hurt because of me." Daniel turned toward her. For the first time since she arrived, his voice carried deep emotion. "When you walked onto this ranch, you weren't just asking for shelter." He stepped closer. "You were asking for a chance at a life where someone would finally stand beside you." The riders stopped at the gate. Daniel looked back toward them. Then he said quietly, "Well, Clara, you found it." The gate creaked open. The men rode in slowly. But Daniel Hayes didn't move. Because some things are worth fighting for. And for the first time in years, Daniel realized he wasn't protecting just a ranch anymore. He was protecting the woman who had brought his lonely world back to life. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone take that away.